Yeah. Welcome everyone and professors and also lecturers in our faculty and also from other university in Indonesia. So before we start, I would like to let our head of the doctoral program, Alice, of linguistics in Udayana to say words in this event. So I will let Professor Artawa to say a few opening words for our speaker and also for other participants in this session. Professor Artawa.
Okay, thank you, Dede.
Yeah, I can hear you, Prof. So
can you hear me?
Very clear.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, who will be talking to us about navigating the space between language and thought. This is the topic in which I think each of us should be interested in because it deals with the important relationship between language and thought. So please join me to welcome Professor Alice Gaby, a leading linguist from Monash University. Her interests include semantic and structural typology, the relationship between language, culture, and cognition, and documentation of endangered languages, especially those in Australia. So on behalf of Faculty of Humanities, Udayana University, I would like to say a very big thank you to you, Professor Gaby, for your willingness to share your research and your expertise with us today. And I do hope you can consider or keep in your mind that Udayana is one of your academic homes, because many of us consider Melbourne is our academic home. In the past, we had distinguished linguists from Australia visiting us that I remembered some of them: Nick Evans, Peter Austin, and Barry Blake. Here you are, we have you now, although it is a virtual visit. I'm still honored to have you here. And other thing, this is on personal account. One of my great teacher in Monash now is Professor Kate Burridge. So say my best regard to her. I think that's the introduction from me. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Gaby. And the time is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the very warm welcome, and thank you for the invitation to join you all today. It's a real honour to be with you virtually. I wish I could be there in person, but this is the next best thing. And I'm honoured to join such esteemed company. Nick Evans was, in fact, my own PhD supervisor, so we have an excellent lineage here.
Oh, yes, he gave me a chance to visit. I knew for 3 months last time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I am just sharing my screen now. I hope now the slides are visible to you all.
Yep, I can see it. So yeah, you can start, I think. Okay.
Okay, so thank you again for having me. Today, I would like to survey what I see as a chasm between research that emphasizes what's universal to human language and cognition all around the world, and research that emphasizes diversity. And this debate has come to be associated with the question of whether or not the particular language or languages you speak shape the way you think about the world around you. I will argue today that I think this debate has become unnecessarily polarized, and that our research in linguistics is far better served by being willing to acknowledge mixed evidence. Sometimes the evidence will point a little bit one way, a little bit the other way, and there can be grey areas that are in between the two extreme positions. But before I get to that, just to introduce a bit more what I see as this divide. Okay, so before linguistics existed as a field, Franz Boas, an anthropologist, was someone I really see as bridging this divide between the research emphasising the universal, common humanity of all people and our languages, and the more relativist emphasis on diversity. So Boas's research on the one hand emphasised what he called the psychic unity of mankind, while he also paid keen attention to diversity in language and culture. So he proposed that a meaning category that seems natural to speakers of one language can seem completely arbitrary to speakers of another language. Now, since linguistics has emerged as its own field of research, this debate has become more polarised, and I think it's often framed as a debate over whether linguistic categories simply express our universal cognitive structures. So on the left of the slide here, we have a universal brain structure that's common to all humans, universal patterns of cognition, and these determine the structures and forms of our languages. And then on the other side, the idea that language emerges from and is responsive to the context it's spoken within, both social contexts, environmental contexts, cultural contexts, historical contexts. And then not only does language emerge at least partly from this broader context, but then language itself can be one of the forces that shapes our patterns of cognition. Now, debate around these ideas has raged with sometimes furious intensity, and people on each side of the debate have at times characterized the opposing positions as ridiculous. So I won't go into all of these debates, but you may remember debates over whether there are so many words for snow in Eskimo languages, as Boas called them now, Inuit, Inuktitut, and so on. This was debunked by Jeff Pullum and then more recently revisited by Terry Regier and his colleagues. There have been debates about time stemming from Benjamin Lee Wharf's work with the Hopi, which again was debunked and then revisited. But in all this work, people on the universalist side have characterized the opposing relativists as thinking of language like a straitjacket, that language is forcing us into thinking about the world in a particular way, and that we have no sort of free will to think outside these structures of language. While people on the relativist side have mocked universalists of having this very simplistic notion of how words and concepts map onto the world and onto each other. And as I've said, what I want to argue for is the fact that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think actually in reality, the relativist position is far less extreme than universalists sometimes make it out to be. And likewise, the universalist position is a lot less extreme than relativists make it out to be. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on two key questions in this area. The first is whether our environment is an important force in shaping language. So is language shaped by the physical and or cultural environment of speakers? Can we understand something about the world, the inner world and the outer world that speakers live in from the forms of their language? And the second question being, does language shape the thought habits of those speakers? So throughout this, I want to seek a way of embracing linguistic diversity and view it as having more than just a surface level significance without falling into the trap of exoticization. So, to begin with, the general public's interest in the semantics of languages they don't already speak is usually limited to those lists of so-called untranslatable words. We see them a lot in Australian newspapers and social media. I'm sure this is globally widespread. Now, linguists will usually counter that, well, anything can be translated into any language given time and care. So it's never really true that these words are untranslatable. And in fact, these sorts of lists always disprove the idea that they're untranslatable because they always explain what each word means. And yet it is nevertheless true that the particular clusters of meaning that can be economically expressed by a single word or in the grammatical system will tell a story about what speakers are motivated to talk about often. So the fact that a particular meaning is packaged in a single word in one language and not another isn't irrelevant or meaningless. So I'm going to try and whet your appetites with some little examples of these ideas, mostly from the semantic domain of kinship, because that's been a particular research interest of mine. But also thinking about the present times and the fact that we're all together here online. I'll also be connected to the present pandemic. So this pandemic has created a need for new words to do with social distancing, these kind of online communication, all sorts of things that we're having to do in new ways because of the pandemic. And in Australia, many of our Aboriginal languages spoken here, so before English speakers colonised Australia, there were several hundred Aboriginal languages already spoken here. And traditionally, and in many places still today, it was required in these Aboriginal societies that you keep physically distant from people in certain kin relationships. So a mother-in-law and son-in-law couldn't get too close to one another and couldn't communicate with one another directly. Now, teacher linguist Yalma Yunupingu has observed that students who are now having to sit 1.5 meters apart from each other at Yirrkala school are described as rumaru, or in this avoidance relationship with one another. While in Cape York, Puktair speakers are already used to this little dance we're all learning or have learnt well by now, where you have to step off the path to let someone pass the other way without going too close to them, because where Puktair is spoken, you shouldn't go too near an avoidance relative. So they have this verb mangwargant, which means to go somewhere via this circuitous, indirect route so that you avoid getting too close to someone like a mother-in-law or brother-in-law. Okay, now those were a couple of examples of how meanings that are important in one culture but not so widespread or important to another will become lexicalized only where they're important or useful, although they're becoming more useful globally now. Now I want to shift to looking at the grammatical system. And in particular, I want to begin by looking at pronouns in Lardil, a language of Mornington Island up here in the Gulf of Carpentaria in the north of Australia, so where that blue dot is. Each dot on that map is a different language, Aboriginal language. So this paradigm just shows the non-singular pronouns of Laerdal, because I couldn't fit all of the pronouns on a slide. And I want to particularly point out here in yellow that where English has just one non-singular first-person pronoun, we, Laerdal has 4. So we have an inclusive-exclusive distinction, whether or not the addressee is included in the pronoun, and different pronouns for dual, so exactly 2 people up here at the top, versus plural, which is 3 or more people. Okay, so far that's pretty typical of Australian Aboriginal languages, but where Laerdal becomes particularly interesting, for me at least, is the fact that actually it's not just 4 pronouns corresponding to we in English, but actually 8, because Laerdal also makes a distinction between people who are what we call harmonics, so either in the same generation as one another or exactly 2 generations apart. So those are the harmonic kin, as opposed to disharmonic kin, who are separated by an odd number of generations. So a father and his son are disharmonic because they're 1 generation apart. A great-grandmother and her great-grandchildren are disharmonic because they're 3 generations apart. But cousins are harmonic, they're in the same generation. Or if I want to talk about something I did with my grandparents, that would also be harmonic. So if I said my grandfather and my grandmother and I went to the movies, I would say nyali, because we are 3 people, so we have the plural form, not the dual, and it's exclusive. I'm not talking about you, my addressees, I'm talking about them and me. So I would, and we're harmonic, so nyali. Okay, so that's pretty complicated, coming certainly from my perspective as an English speaker, and I think for many of us, but it's still not even as complicated as the Aranda pronoun. So Aranda is spoken right in the centre of Australia. And in Aranda, and these are just the dual pronouns, so the pronouns for exactly 2 people. We not only have a harmonic-disharmonic distinction to do with the generations, but also a distinction between agnatic and non-agnatic kin, which is just a fancy anthropology term for people who are related through the male line of descent. So agnatic kin would be my father, my father's father, my father's sister and brother, my father's brother's children, because we're all related through the male line. But my own children are non-agnatic because I'm a woman, they're related through a female. My mother's father, everyone through my mother's line will be non-agnatic. So the point I really want to emphasize here is that to be able to speak Aranda, you need to be paying attention to kin relationships all the time, because you can't use something as simple as a pronoun. You can't just say, you know, they or we or you, without knowing whether you're talking about people who are in the same generation, how many generations apart they are, whether they're related through male lineage or not. So these are things that it's certainly possible to pay attention to as an English speaker or an Indonesian speaker, but we don't have to pay attention to it. And so arguably, we are less likely to be tracking it as rigorously. Okay. I've already been speaking about kinship. I tend to get a bit carried away when I talk about these things, so I will skip tri-relational kin terms in Gurindji, but needless to say, there are plenty of wonderfully complex ways in which kinship finds its way into the grammar of Australian Aboriginal languages. Okay, so now I want to revisit the question of whether language is shaped by, so far we've talked about the extent to which language may be shaped by cultural environment. So if we are in a cultural environment in which kinship relationships, how you relate to people through the family structure, where that's really important and really central to culture, that can manifest in both the lexicon and grammar. So I would say, in response to this question, does language offer us a window on the inner lives of speakers? Yes, I would say perhaps to a degree, but we need to proceed with caution here, because while Jacques Dubois has said grammars code best what speakers do most, so what people are talking about most frequently using a language will find its way into the structures of that language. But I would change the tense of Dubois' quote here, because I think we have to realise that grammars code best what speakers did most at some earlier stage of the language's history. Because if we suddenly become interested in a particular kind of thing, yes, we can coin a new word for that, but that's not going to suddenly show up in our pronouns overnight. It takes many, many generations for structural change to really take hold in a language. So we will see some reflection of the current cultural and social concerns of speakers in the language they use today, but the more deep grammatical structures are going to reflect very long-standing preoccupations, not things that are just of recent interest. And now I'd like to move to the next question. So relating language not to the cultural environment so much as the physical environment speakers live within, and the extent to which language shapes the thought habits of speakers. And here I'd like to take a look at the domain of space. And when I say space, I don't mean this kind of space, outer space and galaxies and astronauts, which is usually what people think about when you say space, but the kind of space we're drawing on when I ask something like, what's the spice just behind and to the left of the paprika? That kind of space. So figuring out where entities are located in physical space with respect to one another. And we need to be able to think about and communicate about spatial relationships in order to function in the world, because avoiding dangers and accessing resources both rely on the ability to be able to perceive and remember spatial configurations. So, given the evolutionary importance of spatial language and spatial cognition, as well as the fact that all humans are sharing the same experience of living on Earth in human bodies and subject to the laws of physics, we might expect that spatial language and cognition are going to look pretty much the same the world over. And in the later part of the last century, Stephen Levinson and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics set out to test whether this prediction bears out. So in the first place, they looked at how people in different speech communities around the world would answer a question like, where is the cat? And they found that these spatial descriptions fall into three basic types. So I'm going to go over the terminology here, but the terminology isn't really essential. I won't draw on it too much. So I more want to focus on the conceptual distinctions between these three types. So the first type, which is called intrinsic, we would say something like, the cat is to the dog's right. So the cat is located according to inherent facets of the dog itself. So the dog has its own left and right side, and we're locating the cat with respect to the dog's own right-hand side. So that's one possible answer. It's not the most natural answer for an English speaker. I don't know about Indonesian. For an English speaker, though, the relative frame of reference is the most common and natural for this kind of scenario. So in the relative frame of reference, we would describe the cat as to the left of the dog. And in this case, what we're doing is bringing into play a third element. We're bringing the position of an observer. And this observer's viewpoint is anchoring the description. So the observer could be the speaker or the addressee or someone else. The kind of default is for it to be the person who's speaking. But it only makes sense to say that the cat is to the left of the dog if the person viewing the cat and dog is standing on this side of them. If we move the observer around, so if we move the observer over to this side, now the cat is to the right of the dog. And if we move the observer over here, now we would say the cat is in front of the dog. So the position of the observer is really crucial in the relative frame of reference. Whereas when we have the intrinsic description saying the cat is to the dog's right, it doesn't matter where we're looking at the cat and the dog from, that will always be true. And then the third reference type here is the absolute, or what's sometimes called geocentric frame of reference. And here we're not relying on any external observer or the particular features of the dog or cat. Instead, we've got some kind of external reference point. For example, a very common one here is the points of the compass, north, south, east, and west. So we could say here that the cat is to the north of the dog. And again, it doesn't matter where we're viewing this from, that will be true. We can take any viewpoint, and we could rotate the dog around, we could rotate the cat around, it would still hold true. Now, in most languages, we have 2 or sometimes 3 of these different frames of reference. In English, we have all 3, as I've illustrated with those example sentences. But speech communities will differ in which one is the most elaborated, which one, is most grammatical. Sometimes there'll be particular affixes or grammatical paradigms that will be using one frame of reference or the other. And languages also differ in which one is the most frequently used and the most sort of natural one to draw on in a particular context. So as I said before, in English, it's more natural to say the cat is to the left of the dog. So we've put a sort of big tick in the relative frame of reference as opposed to the intrinsic and absolute for English. So what this body of research has shown is that there is diversity rather than universals in exactly how spatial relationships are described in language. It does seem to be universal that every language will have some means of talking about spatial relationships, but they do it in quite different ways. Then the next question becomes whether this variation has an impact on how people are actually thinking about space, or whether these varying descriptions are underpinned by some universal patterns of spatial cognition. So is there some kind of cognitive significance of the diversity we see in spatial language? So the next step was for Levinson and his colleagues to test non-linguistic spatial cognition, so how people think about spatial relationships in all of these communities. And they had quite a wide range of different tasks, but I'll illustrate it with this one called the CHIPS recognition task. So here we have these footprints represent the experimental participant who's standing at this table, this north table, and looking at a card that has a yellow circle on the left and a brown circle on the right. Or from an absolute perspective, the yellow circle in the west and the brown circle to the east. So they're asked to memorize the card they're looking at, and then they're moved around to a second table that's 180 degrees rotated. So now they're at the south table, they're shown 4 different cards, and they're asked, which is the card you were looking at before? Now, the prediction is that an English speaker, someone who speaks a language with a relative frame of reference that is dominant, as in English, will choose this card, because they may be saying in the back of their head the yellow circle is on the left, the brown is on the right, or they may just have an imagistic memory of what the card looks like without any language involved, which nevertheless is recorded from their own individual egocentric viewpoint. And that is indeed what they found for English speakers and speakers of other languages like Dutch, which also have a dominant relative frame of reference. But this contrasts with speakers of languages like Aranda and Google Yimidir, which have a dominant absolute frame of reference where they're relying on the external perspective, like the north, south, east, west, or upriver, downriver, uphill, downhill, these sort of wider features of the landscape. They will be far more likely to choose this card, where the brown, from a bird's eye perspective, as we're seeing these tables from, it is sort of objectively the same card, where we have the brown circle on the east and the yellow circle in the west. So that sort of second suite of studies showed that there is also not only significant diversity in spatial language, but this diversity in spatial language correlates with a commensurate diversity in spatial cognition. But there's still a question remaining about whether this correlation can be interpreted as causal. So does the diversity in spatial language actually cause the diversity in spatial cognition, or could there be other reasons people are thinking about spatial relationships differently? And those external reasons are shaping both language and thought. And this certainly has been proposed by researchers like Peggy Lee and Lila Gleitman, who have argued that actually it's not spatial language that is shaping spatial cognition, but perhaps the external physical environment might be shaping both spatial language and spatial cognition independently. And Bill Palmer more recently has made different but similarly strong claims about the role played by the environment, while a more intermediate position has been articulated by Jürgen Bonnemeyer and colleagues, as well as Shapiro and Vasna Mishra. So, to explore this grey area, I want to turn now to a project that is just wrapping up now with my colleagues Bill Palmer, Jonathan Lum and Jonathan Schlossberg, where we've been looking at the spatial language and cognition in atoll environments. So atolls are these sort of donut-shaped rings of islands around a central lagoon, which is quite a specialised physical environment in global terms. And so this made atolls an ideal testing ground to test the extent to which linguistic spatial systems reflect salient features of the external environment, because certainly the lagoon and the islands and then the outside ocean are all very salient for people in these environments, but also to test how closely spatial cognition correlates with language and or the environment. And so to do this, we took language and environment as independent variables. First, we took a single language, Marshallese, as spoken in the Marshall Islands, and looked at how it's used in 3 different environments. In the first place, on the atolls of the Marshall Islands, which is where Marshallese originally developed. Then as spoken on a singleton island, so an island that is not part of an atoll, it's just all alone in the ocean. And thirdly, how it's spoken in Arkansas in America, because there is actually quite a large population of Marshallese speakers. The largest population of Marshallese outside of the Marshall Islands is in Arkansas in America. Okay, so that in the first place, we took just a single language and looked at how people use spatial language in Marshallese in 3 very different environments. And then the next step kept the environment constant, so the atoll environment, but looked at 2 entirely genetically and areally unrelated languages, Marshallese on the one hand and Divehi on the other. Okay, so Marshallese as spoken on the Marshall Islands was our baseline condition here. So to our first question, can we predict a language's spatial reference system from the environment in which it is spoken? Well, our findings showed some effect of environment on language, but it's far from deterministic. So there are some commonalities in having a landward, seaward axis to some degree, but exactly how these terms are used differs quite a lot between the languages. There's some sort of lagoon side, ocean side distinction, but in Divehi, these terms are only very weakly grammaticized and not often used. In Marshallese, they're very heavily used. So there's some effect of environment on spatial language, but it's really not true that we can say, all right, in a particular geographical environment, we will find these linguistic features. We can predict the form of language from the environment. And then our next question was to look at how these terms were actually used, which became a much more interesting question. So Jonathan Lum and Jonathan Schlossberg elicited a lot of spatial language using cards that we would have one person describe a particular card to another person who's sort of looking at the full set of cards. And so if the describer says, okay, the man is facing away towards the tree, or the man is on this side looking away from the tree, they would come up with all sorts of different descriptions like this, and then the matcher would have to try and figure out which card matched the description they were given. Now, for time, I will not go into all the details of findings from this, but I want to pull out what I think is the most significant finding here. So if we I just want to explain this chart to you first. So along the bottom here, we have all the different sites that this experiment was run. So the leftmost columns, so these 4 on the left, are all islands where Divehi is spoken, and then the 4 columns on the right are all places where Marshallese is spoken, as written on the bottom of the slide. So the first column is Malay, which is often called the Manhattan or New York of the Marshall Islands. It's very, very densely populated. There's a lot of high-rise buildings. There's really not a square inch of free soil on that island. It's just covered in buildings and people. Then our second column is the Adu Atoll, which is a much more classic atoll environment. Then we have the next two columns being Lamu Atoll, which was matched specifically to be the same shape, though sort of in reverse, as an equivalent atoll in the Marshall Islands, Jaluit Atoll. So all these four columns represent very similar physical environment. Then we have the Singleton Island, Kili, and last of all, Springdale in Arkansas. So this is landlocked right in the middle of America, no sea for miles and miles. You never see the sea in Arkansas. It's all concrete and some hills. So very different kind of environment. And the first thing you might notice is that this Springdale really leaps out as having this relative, so the kind of left-right terminology rather than the geographical based terms like lagoonward, oceanward, north, south, east, west, uphill, downhill, upriver, downriver, these kind of environment-based geocentric terms, which include absolute and landmarks, are only 6% in Springdale, whereas 94% were the relative or egocentric terms. So that stands out as the total opposite of what we see for all the other Marshallese speakers. So that was kind of what we expected to see from our hypotheses. But more interestingly, we saw quite different results in every location in the Maldives. So importantly, I want to draw your attention to these two different columns on Lamu Atoll, where we get very different proportions of relative and absolute geocentric terms. And what we think that's about is actually the mode of subsistence for people living on those islands. So it's not about the geographical environment that makes a difference, but what makes a difference is how people are engaging with their environment. So if you live on an atoll island, but you're sitting indoors as a bookkeeper or a teacher, you're working at a computer or whatever you might be doing, you're much more likely to use the relative frame of reference terms than if you're a fisherman who's out on a boat having to navigate by paying attention to your surroundings. That kind of engagement with the environment is what predicts the use of geocentric and absolute terms in these kind of non-linguistic tasks rather than the environment itself. Okay, so now I will actually, and this becomes even clearer when we look at the orientation terms. I'm going to skip past all of this because I want to close by talking about the domain of time. So this has been another long-standing interest of mine and some of my colleagues, at least two of whom are here today. Thank you. So it's been long observed for many centuries now that we have different metaphors of time available to us. So time is a very slippery concept to understand, but in general, there are two different kinds of metaphor that people around the world will draw on. Either we talk about time as moving with respect to our observer, or that we are moving over a kind of landscape of time. So in the time-moving landscape, the future is ahead of us and it's coming towards us very rapidly and then going past us, beyond us, into our back space, as opposed to the time passing is motion over a landscape where the ego is moving. We have the points of time along the landscape and we are experiencing time by sort of walking along it towards the future. again, leaving the past time events behind us. Now, if we look at languages around the world, Rafael Núñez and Yves Sweetser have observed that all languages that they've seen so far take their vocabulary of time primarily from space. So it's really an interesting question. I'm going to skip over this, but it's an interesting question whether then the different spatial systems we see in the languages of the world will have an effect on our temporal systems. Because as we've seen, we've got quite a lot of diversity in spatial reference. And early studies in temporal reference show that there is some diversity there too. So in Aymara, for example, we see a wholesale reversal of the English timeline, and Indonesian for that matter, where for the Aymara, the past is described as in front of them and the future is behind. And likewise in Vietnamese, we have the future coming from behind us. So we say, sort of, behind my back, a warm spring is coming. The spring is approaching us from behind. And then once events have passed us, we see them, we have visual access to the past. We know what's in the past. It's before us, in front of us in that respect. So it's sort of this opposite direction. We have the ego facing the opposite direction towards the past. Events are coming to us from the future, and then once they've passed, they are in front of the body. Okay, so we know that people around the world talk about time in significantly different ways. And we also know that differences in how people talk about space correlate with differences in spatial cognition. So the question becomes, will we find some kind of correlation between how people talk about time and how they think about it? So if our spatial language is connected to our temporal language, does that mean we will find temporal cognition varying in similar ways? Which is connected to, of course, the big question of the movie Arrival, if you have seen that, though the answer is clearly not going to be as extreme as that. So to answer this question, I worked with Lera Boroditsky, who actually was in that banana vehicle in the picture here. So we showed cards like this, cards of an event unfolding over time, like a banana being eaten, and asked people to line them up from the first to last, or, you know, a duck hatching from an egg, or a dog growing, or an apple being eaten. And English monolinguals will line them up from left to right, 100% of the time, at least at Stanford. Whereas when we asked speakers of Kutayur, an Aboriginal language from Australia, they had much more varied responses. And in fact, I will skip the details, say that their responses were laid out basically from east to west. So in line with this geocentric frame, emphasising the sort of passage of the sun, which of course rises in the east and sets in the west. So then the question becomes, well, is this really about language or is this about culture? And to answer that, I also tested ethnically Kutayur people in Pomperau who had been raised as monolingual in English. So these were typically younger generations who just spoke English, not Kutayur, and they behaved just like the English monolinguals at Stanford, with all their arrangements going from left to right. So does this show that temporal language is shaping temporal cognition? Not quite, because curiously, there are actually no east to west metaphors in spoken Kutayur, even though words equivalent to east and west are being used constantly in reference to space. So instead, what I think is going on here is that spatial language is shaping temporal language, and it's also shaping temporal cognition. And it's actually this, it's shaping spatial cognition. So our language of space is shaping how we think about space, and then how people think about space is what is shaping how people think about time. But we don't have a window on temporal cognition here. So again, I want to be a little bit more cautious in interpreting these results, because what the experiment tested was how people represent time, how they will line up picture cards, which shows a way of representing time, but it doesn't offer us a window on how they're thinking as such. And so if we want to look at how people are thinking, a much more promising avenue are things like gesture. There's been some work on gesture in Aymara and Vietnamese showing time metaphors corresponding with how people are thinking about time. And most recently, Pak Gede presented some research in collaboration with me and Poppy Siahan, who's also here, I think, at the International Language and Cognition Conference in Japan. So I am out of time now, so you will have to ask him for all the details of that another time. I'm sure many of you will have already heard some of that result. And there is, of course, always more to discover. So watch this space. But in conclusion, my answer to the question of whether language shapes the way we think or vice versa, does our universal human cognitive architecture determine language? I think the truth is both. The answer is yes. There is some of each in the mix, but it's more complex than taking a really strong polarized position on one side of the debate or the other will do justice to. So language is shaped by our universal and human cognitive structures, but it's also shaped by our physical, social, and communicative context. And the way we think is in turn shaped by what we say and what we hear, what we do, and the world we inhabit. And I think, any piece of research on any part of this puzzle is really valuable, and especially valuable when it's done with an open mind that is open to different possible interpretations. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Alice for a nice presentation, and I will now share screen for questions from the chat so that you can read that easily.
Thank you. So I do believe that cultural environment is a very important influence on language, and I think there is no real explanation for the amount of diversity we see in the world's languages. I'm sure Professor Nick Evans, when he spoke, will have emphasized diversity in languages around the world, and there is just so much variation in human languages. And I think, part of that can be attributed just to chance and history, but the very particular kinds of correlation we see with cultural preoccupations, as I, talked about a bit in the case of kinship, I think we can only understand that if we allow for the fact that cultural environment is playing some role in influencing language. Thank you for the question.
Next question.
So I'm not sure, tell me if I don't interpret this question correctly, but I think if this question is asking how can we get different, perhaps where languages are occupying the same territory, and we're having people who might speak different languages.
Maybe Ibu Gayu could ask or clarify.
Yeah, please.
So to clarify my question, because a spatial relation between language is different. For instance, when we have in Indonesian, we have atas and bawah, but in English we have above, we have under, we have below. But in Indonesian we have only atas or bawah, but in English we have on and we have over, but in Indonesian we just say di atas. So I would like to ask how spatial relations are formed across languages differently in terms of the condition of the people.
Right, thank you for the clarification. Yes, so that's a beautiful example, and I regret that I didn't have time to talk about these kinds of topological relations in this talk, but you're absolutely right. We see forms in English, prepositions like above, over, under, and these are often the most difficult forms to learn when we learn a new language. So certainly speaking from experience, there is no language other than English that I can speak where I'm really confident I've mastered these forms, because they can vary, sometimes very subtly and sometimes in really extreme ways of, even if we take a word like in or inside, we can sort of think, well, it's obvious when something is inside another thing, but actually no two languages seem to just sort of draw the boundaries around what counts as being inside another thing in exactly the same way. So if, we have an apple inside a bowl where the bowl is open at the top, is the apple inside the bowl or not? I mean, for me it is. I just said the apple inside the bowl because in English that counts, but there are certainly many languages like Korean where that wouldn't be inside. Or if it's on a plate, for me in English, now it's on, not in, but in other languages that's still the sort of inside relation. So we can have these quite different kinds of mapping from these spatial terms from language to language. And I think this diversity is particularly a product of the frequency of these terms. So words like in, on, by, under, over, we use all the time, and they're so important and so central, which means they're sort of often subject to semantic change. So even words that might historically come from the same source, like in English and Dutch, which are really very closely related, if you look at these spatial forms in the two languages, they will be very different in terms of their meaning range. So, as I say, they're a real hazard for the language learner. Thanks for the question.
This is the next question.
Yes, this is another really great question, and I don't think I have a definitive answer. I think this is an empirical question that we really need more research to understand fully, because I think that, yes, we certainly might expect that language might be subject to evolutionary pressures that are going to see it change and adapt to the changing environment of speakers, the changing communicative needs of speakers, and those same pressures are going to apply to the way those speakers think, and so that the language and cognition might evolve in parallel along with the culture. But I think it's also quite possible that, you know, sometimes the evolutionary pressures might apply differently to culture and language and thought. And we can have sometimes, you know, in any language, there will be some relics of past meanings and ideas that aren't as relevant right now, and they might just be retained in perhaps some folk songs or something. But grammatical structures too can be kind of relic of earlier forms. Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question, and one that deserves a lot more consideration and research. Thank you.
Can I say something, Prof. Gaby?
Please. Please go ahead.
Yes, I've been wondering which one is right. Culture, the product of language, language, the product of culture, thing like this one. So which one comes first? That's still confusing then. Regardless the what we call it, the relativity of the mind production or the growth of the mind or our brain in this respect.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I wish I knew the ultimate answer to this. I think it's just such a fascinating question, but we need more research to be done to really gather the empirical data on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Next.
So, yes, again, I think this is a very interesting issue. So, and I apologize, I had to go over this very quickly in the presentation, but what we really saw in the atoll context was that we had people speaking the same language in identical environments. So, in this case, speaking Divehi in different atoll islands around the Central Lagoon. And so they all had landmark cues available to them. They were all tested, and I didn't mention this, but we systematically tested for every group. We systematically tested the number who were tested outside on the beach and those who were tested indoors. And that availability of landmarks was controlled, so it was the same for all groups. But that didn't predict how people use spatial language. What predicted the way people use the spatial language was how their community engaged with the local environment. And interestingly, their community as a whole rather than them individually. So even if a particular individual was not a fisherman themselves, so they didn't go out on the boats to collect the fish, if they lived on a fishing island and were interacting with people who were doing this kind of work all the time, that was enough to foster a kind of community of practice of using these geocentric terms in solving the particular tasks. So that is what makes me think that, you know, it's about how we engage with the environment around us and not just the presence of these particular landmark cues. Oh, yes, thank you for this question. And I we'll have to take a moment to look up the answer. I might have to email you after the presentation if it takes me too long. I'm afraid it's been too long and it's flown from my mind in terms of the number of people who were in these experiments in the atolls. But yes, Jonathan Lum and Jonathan Schlossberg were very careful to get all the demographic data about occupations and so on before we ran the experiment. So that data was collected for everybody participating in the experiment. It wasn't really, we didn't have the hypothesis that for example, occupation would be playing any role here. That was something that we only learned after all the results came in. We didn't really predict that would be a key finding there. But fortunately, they did collect all the information that allowed us to get that as a result.
Okay. Wait. Okay. I hope my voice is not waving now. Okay. Yeah. Good. So right. We still have time if anyone wants to ask or participant wants to ask directly to Alice. Arya? Hello? Okay, I am inviting once more, maybe people didn't hear. If there are any questions to Alice, you could ask directly the question. If not, Arya, you want to ask question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes, I can.
Can you hear me? All right, thank you. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm asking question, Professor Elias Gaby. So the first thing that I would like to say is, so I'm quite happy to hear your presentation. So you bring up, excellent stuff there. You can, language affects the way we think. So I read the article by Lera Boroditsky, so how, spatial relation and temporal relations, there is a close relations with human spatial cognitions. But the thing that I would like to say is I would like to add, some more evidence, to show that there is indeed, a connections between language and human cognition. So I did several studies on the relations between relations and human cognitions. So my first study was in 2010. So that is a follow-up study of, Wasman and Dawson. I think you are familiar with Wasman and Dawson. So they did study on spatial relation in the eastern part of Bali. And then the point of their study is showing that, apart from the evidence that, the speakers there use a relative frame of reference, but in general, it shows that, the Balinese speaker in eastern part of Bali use an absolute system, using linguistic and non-linguistic stuff there. And then I did my own study in Balinese for the people living in outside, the southern part of the island. The point of my study is showing that, the Balinese spatial system indeed, affects the way, the Balinese speakers use the spatial relation, in which the absolute system is dominantly by the speaker here. And then I did my study to test that spatial relations in the northern part of Bali. You know what I mean? Because there is a locations of landmark there. North is north. Balinese people living on the southern part of Bali is different from the north side of. For people living in Singaraja, right? And then I did study in 2018, and again, the paper was published in Lingua. So again, so I could show, the language affects human cognition. And then once again, I did study on, but this time, 2019. But this is about, Balinese local sign language, Bengkala Katakolok. You are familiar with Katakolok. So Connie DeFore did study with that one, And then, and then my study shows that, in the Katakolok, even in Katakolok, so the Katakolok, the sign language also affects the way, the human cognitions of speakers there. But that is in spatial relations. I did study in, let's say, universal quantifiers, for example. So my studies show universal quantifiers in Indonesian. So, but my studies show it is not right that, children can acquire concept of universal quantifier from the beginning. In Indonesian, so it takes some time for children to understand the concept of universal quantifier. So my findings confirm that, no strong, solid evidence that, the concept of universal quantifiers can be acquired earlier across languages. And then I did, I think Ibu Dayu, my colleague, said about topological relation. My studies on topological relation also confirm, CIRHSS, for example, so she said, one of the proponents, what is that? The concept of containment, support are universal across languages. And then I think you are familiar that Levinson and his friends studied about, 14 languages, and then they found that, attachment, the concept of attachment is very crucial in that 14 languages. And then in my study in Balinese, Indonesian, and Rongga, the concept of containment, support are not dominant, are not relevant. So what relevant is the concept of expectedness in Rongga, Balinese, and Indonesian, but but that is at least from my finding. But again, if we follow the debate on spatial relation, it began with Pedersen et al. So I think you are familiar with Pedersen et al. So they studied 20 languages, and then they found, language, indeed affect human social cognition. And then, as you said, Lee and Gleitman came up with another experiment showing, humans, so the speakers of any languages can have access to, any spatial relation, even though they, give the universal claim that relative frame of reference is universal. And then another idea from I think Levinson, Rush, and they, they argue, but that is not right, because Lee and Gleitman mistaken the idea of intrinsic features in their experiment. But that's kind of debate,
Yeah.
But again, if we look back to the data of, from topological relation, as you said just now, I'm quite happy that you said that one. In Korean language, if you look at, if you put in English, if you put something in your pocket or in a container, then you can still, in English, something is in something, right? But in Korean, it is sensitive. It depends on the ground where you put something in, right? If you put something in a very tight enclosure, so the suffix of the language will be different from if you put something in a loose container, that kind of stuff. So, the point that I'm saying is, well, I agree with you, with with the evidence that you said just now. But the thing that I would like to ask you is, you know, well, at least from the findings that I have, so I think the nature of the experiment itself needs to be given more attention because it might be a factor to play in when we are doing the experiment. Because I always did, experiment to find out the consistency of the result. So, do you have any words about that one? I mean, so we need to pay attention to the nature of the experiment to be sure that, our experiment is tapping the knowledge of spatial relations of the speakers. So that is the first thing that I would like you to share with me.
Yes, well, thank you. And first of all, it's wonderful to hear about all of these studies. I knew of your work on the spatial relations and but not of the topological relations. So I'll definitely have to follow up on that to learn more. It sounds very fascinating, and likewise the katakolo cognition. So thank you. I mean, in terms of experimental design, I think really crucial thing is not relying on a single point of evidence to draw broad conclusions. So again, I think one of the problems historically has been, of course, we're always, as scientists, it's always much more splashy to publish findings that say, aha, this proves, this particular theory, or this disproves another theory, when in reality, I think the truth is that we're all adding small pieces to a much larger puzzle, that no single study will give the definitive answer. So I think particularly with experimental work, what we want to look for is converging evidence from multiple different experimental designs. Ideally, different experimenters replicating the same experimental design. That's another big problem that, of course, we haven't talked about so much in linguistics, but we've certainly seen in psychology the replication crisis, and findings that so many of these experiments run by a different researcher or research lab will get entirely different results. So I think there's no such thing as a perfect experiment, but what we need is, different experiments that will come at these problems from different angles, and then, converge on the truth between them. I'm also just popping my email address into the chat too, because I would love to continue the conversation with any of you who are interested down the track. But I see also, if there is still time, there is a question from...
you want to answer Ibu Poppy's question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can,
yeah, we still have 10 more minutes. Yeah. Go ahead, Alice.
So yes, this question about an experiment with Balinese speakers about the absolute-oriented spatial frame of reference, and whether that would also be used when people speak about time, and particularly co-speech gesture. I think, again, I think we want to see multiple different experimental designs to also safeguard against elements of the experimental setup that might prejudice the results in one direction or another. So again, I always think, there's no one perfect experiment, but I think complementary here, there's some work by, and now I'm just blanking on his name, but Bodo Winter and some colleagues in the UK and various people elsewhere who've looked at temporal gesture and have certainly elicited descriptions of past events and future events. We've had experiments designed around having people reflect on what their life was like 5 years in the past, and then think about what their life will be like 5 years in the future, and just have people talk naturally or semi-naturally as it's possible to get in an experimental context, but having them, talk about past and future narratives and see where their gestures go. I think there's also some really promising work looking at eye tracking studies. So having people just, again, thinking without the linguistic stream being present, but thinking about past and future and seeing where their gaze travels. And there are all sorts of problems with that too, because it can be difficult to tell the difference between, for example, people looking up. Some experiments have interpreted people as looking up when they think about the future, when it actually seems that they're probably looking further in the distance, which, as you move towards the horizon, that's often associated with the gaze sort of traveling up a little. So again, as many different converging points of evidence is ideal. There have been some lab studies having people wearing sort of sensors and judging their posture. So see if people lean forward slightly when they're thinking. I think these were German speakers. They were found to lean forward slightly when thinking about the future and lean back slightly when thinking about the past. I would just love to be able to test that with speakers of these absolute frame of reference languages, but again, it's a difficult thing to take out of the lab. They're very, very expensive to get the equipment, so it's not a small thing to do, but there are certainly lots of experiments that could be run. I'd certainly be extremely excited to see the results.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Alice. I don't know why it's my voice. Check. Okay.
It sounds good for me.
Maybe, yeah. Okay. So we still have 7 minutes, but I think no one asked another question. Oh, Pak Arya, I see you raise hand.
Can I still see something?
Yeah, Pak. Go ahead.
All right. So, Professor Gaby, so, I was thinking last night, so I read about, I was watching on YouTube about Pagayaman in Singaraja, the northern part of Bali. Pagayaman, right? Yeah, Pagayaman. So this should be, a very interesting, place to do spatial relation study and also temporal relation study. What I'm thinking is Pagayaman is, but I haven't been to this place before, but I just watched on YouTube last night. And then I was thinking because the people at this area are Muslim. As Muslim people, so of course they read our Quran, right? And then I'm not sure if we can test, because they live in Bali, they speak Balinese. I think I haven't been there, and then it's good to test the spatial relation. But they are Muslim people, so they they read Quran from right to left, and then we can do like probably your study with Borodisi in, is it Pampru languages? Pampru language in
Yeah.
right. So I don't know how to say that language correctly. And then see how the spatial relation there and then temporal relations there. Guyana. But again, so I have to be honest, I haven't been to this place. I just watched on YouTube and then I heard about the language, but just rough idea, so if we can do, a study to test the relation between space and, time relation. Just hit my mind and then I just let you know. Yeah, study about that one. So
I think that would be a really fascinating case study. And of course, you not only have the right to left writing system, which we know has a very important influence on temporal cognition, as a very powerful kind of analogy for representing time, but also, with Muslim prayer, to always be mindful of orientation towards Mecca. There are sort of things beyond the local geographical environment that, there's a cultural prompting to pay attention to a particular directionality, which could also be a shaping factor. So certainly, I think it would be a fascinating test case. If you ever do find out more, I would love to see what you find.
So let's see. Yeah, that's just a rough idea. Thanks, Professor. Excellent stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the participants who have participated in this session. From wherever you are, I really appreciate your time to stand here, and also to Alice especially. I've been missing hearing your talk and also your voice for the past year, so it's great to have you here. And I've put on the chat for the upcoming speakers of session. So we'll be having Anna Wirsbika and Martin Hilbert in November 2020. We will be sharing info via emails, and so stay tuned for that. So I think this is the end, so I will need to stop here.
Thanks again. It was great, Alan.
Yeah, thank you, Alice, for your time. I know it's already